The CCCR, or Centre for Creative and Cultural Research, investigates the ancient, innovative relationship between social culture and creative production. Based in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra, we generate scholarship and artwork in a wide array of humanities, social science, applied and creative disciplines. You are listening to a fresh presentation from the CCCR's Culture and Creativity Seminar Series. The presentation was delivered with slides. To view those slides, or to learn more about the Centre's work, please follow the links in the program notes. This podcast was recorded on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. Hi everybody, my name is Paul McGee. I'm the Director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research. I want to start by acknowledging that we are here on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal people. I pay my respects to all Indigenous people here today and to all elders past and present. So today we are going to hear about a particularly interesting topic. This is some work that Owen has been doing with the UC Hospital, a hospital here on campus, for the last 2 years now. And it'll be really great. This is, I think, the first big public report on that work. So Owen Bullock has published 4 collections of poetry, 5 books of haiku, a bilingual edition of tanka, and also a novella. A new book of haiku titled The Scuppered Lily will be launched in August of this year, along with an academic book, How to Write Haiku, which is going to be launched in 2027. Owen's research interests include creative arts and wellbeing, haikai literature, poetry and process, semiotics, and literary studies, prose poetry, and also collaboration. Owen is discipline lead for creative writing here at UC, and his other interests include music, juggling, and chess. Please join me in welcome.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for being here, everyone. Yuma, Daro Anuna, Daro Ngunnawal. We're on Ngunnawal country. I'm very grateful to be living here on Ngunnawal country and visiting Ngambri country, of course, nearby. My partner and I, we went to Square Rock Lookout on Monday, and I was enjoying communing with the granite. I feel never alone because I always have life forms, and I feel like rocks have a kind of rudimentary consciousness. They're enough for me. And I wrote this haiku: granite, 10,000 years to scale the mountain. Granite, 10,000 years to scale the mountain. Granite's particularly resonant for me because there's granite in Cornwall, where I come from. And this is a very fresh haiku, but it's been completely rewritten already. Originally, it was something about 1,000 years because, let's face it, humans can't really imagine a very huge span of time. But I get a very much stronger sense of deep time when I'm in a place like this. So I changed it to 10,000 years, which is also emblematic in Taoism of the myriadness of things. But really, it's 400 million years that the granite took to rise up through other levels of rock and then to be eroded to the shape it is now. So that's my acknowledgement of country, I guess. It goes right down to the rocks. So I'm going to talk about the hospital program, but a bit of background about how I got involved with this in this sort of work through the arts program. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the arts program. This was the brainchild of Brigadier Wayne Goodman and our own Ian Drayton, who was our faculty manager for a while and then leading research. And the creative writing component of it was originated by our colleague Tony Eaton, wrote the first curriculum for that. So I really want to acknowledge that. It's been going since 2015. So it assists military personnel with PTSD and other disorders, anxiety disorders, sometimes injured as well. It's been running since 2015. It's a month-long intensive program. I've been involved since 2016, and it's really kind of had life-altering effects and life-saving experiences described through it. I found it made a big difference to the way I teach. Like I really, especially around before and after COVID, working in a program like this with a very different demographic of people was sort of made me think a lot more about the pastoral care element of teaching in general. So it really kind of encouraged me to think about how I care for people. And a couple of, although the experiences are the most important things, a couple of the statistics on the research on this program do say quite a lot. And a couple of my favorites here. I'm forgetting that this is different. So a shot of the showcase that celebrates and concludes the arts program. Participants take part in music for a month or visual arts or creative writing at the moment. And Tavis Watt and our own Jeff Gray have done research on the program, found that 61% of those interviewed reported benefits of more than 2 years duration, which was wonderful, and 85% still maintaining some sort of arts practice, 2 to 4.5 years later, which is so good to hear. And we've done a lot of writing about it. These are some of the articles I've been involved in, articulating what's our pedagogy in that program and some of the effects. And if you want a kind of summary of it, I gave a podcast talk a while ago for the journal in New Zealand, or based in New Zealand, Journal of Creative Arts Therapies. They have a podcast, and talked on that about the whole process. This led to an invitation from wonderful Jenny McFarlane, who I'll introduce a bit more in a moment, from University of Canberra Hospital, saying, "Can you come and do something here, maybe with poetry?" So I put my hand up for that, and we started a pilot program in 2023, Poetry and Wellbeing, a pilot program to evaluate the impact of creative writing for patients in short and long-term rehabilitation. So it aimed to show that creative engagement could facilitate improved well-being, foster resilience, and generate new skills which might be useful in the future. So that was kind of our aim, and it was great getting that invitation. So the pilot was for 8 weeks. 14 people took part. Evaluation was by survey and sort of open qualitative question. We worked with people who were recovering from strokes. That was the sort of commonest thing. Sometimes serious accident, surgery, and folks living with Parkinson's. And in talking with the hospital and with Jenny in advance about what the needs were, we identified things like boredom, lack of engagement, the need for a more varied experience whilst in the hospital, ways to cope with traumatic elements of conditions or injuries, a need for people to express themselves and to connect or reconnect with community. And we feel like creative writing is sort of really primed to do some of those things. Anyone who's written a lot for a period of time knows that it has personal therapeutic benefits as well as whatever engagement they get out of sharing their writing in the world through presentation or publication. And so that potential has been discussed in lots of contexts. I particularly read up on aphasia before starting the program, knowing that a lot of participants would probably be recovering from stroke. But it's also been quite well documented in treatment of dementia, cancer, heart attacks, depression, mental illness, PTSD, and dealing with pain. So it's got a pretty extensive track record, and I'm still discovering more areas. I need to do more research on that. How does it do this? articulating through what sometimes doesn't happen is a good bet. Pennebaker wrote some very influential research from the 80s onwards. He and his partner write, painful events that are not structured into a narrative format may contribute to the continued experience of negative thoughts and feelings. And poetry has been identified in particular as a powerful reflective tool. And part of the work it does, and I've seen this in action so clearly so many times now, that I can absolutely pay testament to this, that it helps in reestablishing the use of symbolic language, which is often shredded by traumatic experiences. And it includes the ability to decode as well as use symbolic language. And you know, there's the ability that poetry has through things like symbolism to go from a particular to a general, to be generalizable. And I think some of the poetry we've encountered, now that in the ongoing program we're hoping to publish some of it, I think it will be very useful for other people dealing with the same kind of problems. And writing about trauma, for example, can be preceded, and often is, by oral storytelling and sharing, not necessarily signaling that that's what you're doing. And disclosures of trauma have been shown to produce health benefits. The increased vulnerability that leads us to encourages post-traumatic growth, for example. You need a very safe space to do it, but we really work on that. So the aims of the original pilot and the ongoing aims are the same, were to evaluate whether writing poetry could help reframe personal narratives in a meaningful way, you know, increasing self-reflection and improving well-being and mindfulness. So the idea of reframing your story. Two of the things that came across strongest from the literature to me about the potential of writing about your own experiences was that it gives you control over the experience because you're writing the narrative of it. It gives you distance from that experience, and you can change both the writing and your perception of that through it. So we're aiming to give participants the skills and the opportunity to write expressively over a period of at least 4 weeks, sometimes more than that. And obviously, along the way, alongside these main aims, we're creating a safe space where people can share written works and the discussion around them, offer feedback. So the pilot program was 1 session per week. It was designed to work as a standalone unit because we knew people would be discharged at short notice sometimes, and that's worked pretty well. And thinking of the oral storytelling, at the start of sessions, and particularly at the start of the program itself or the reestablishment of it, participants often needed to talk a lot to kind of download, to be aware that there was someone listening. That was part of creating that safe space. And I think we established that, and the interactions were very dynamic. And it was, you know, it's been so interesting to sort of make notes about what people tended to be preoccupied with, various kinds of grief, loss of independence, loss of health, loss of privacy. There are a lot of tears in these sessions as people talk about these things. Living in the contested space that is that individual's private room, but also the nurse's workstation, is quite problematic. So sometimes we improvise writing exercises around that. Sometimes I'll come in with a poem to share and an exercise I've planned that's based on that poem. Sometimes we do that. Sometimes the discussion of the poem will take it in a completely different direction, and so I'll sort of improvise an exercise on that. Sometimes participants are just really focused on a particular aspect of their experience at the moment or of the hospital experience, and so we'll write about that. So one week this idea came up about what I labeled contested spaces. What do we do in this awkward space? So invited participants to write about a contested space, not necessarily the hospital, could be anything. And that proved to be very productive. Another discussion was all about risk. So I invited people to talk about a time in their life when they took a lot of risks, and that kind of, evoked memories and feelings of agency, which I think was quite useful. And to summarize what we felt we'd experienced in the pilot, it very much gave voice to participants' experiences, and expression, voice, and agency sort of came across as keywords. I discovered various things about teaching in this new context. It's very different again to the arts program. It had to be delivered very slowly, allowing a lot of time, as I say, for conversation, but also channeling that meaningfully into discussion and writing exercises, but allowing a lot more time than usual for every activity. And because it was so individual and kind of tailored to participants, it responded, as I mentioned, to the challenges they were facing. And I found it a deeply humbling experience, as it is every week I go down there. So as I mentioned, we improvised writing exercises. We also worked quite a bit with the idea of poetic constraint, which a lot of writers find meaningfully useful. It's talked a lot quite in the literature of aphasia, that's particularly beneficial. Participants sometimes, and again recently, spontaneously commented or asked questions about the use of poetic constraint, even though I never used that term. And one of the things that happened was, where someone was suffering from aphasia, which is, a condition where there's kind of some damage to centers in the brain that mean that using language and interpreting language becomes problematic. And in some cases, it was difficult for participants to volunteer information that could be used in writing. Sometimes we were scribing for people, but I found that improvising leading questions would draw material out and facilitate the writing of a poem. We could still write a poem. So we had a simple survey that had been used for the robotics project from Raoul Kramer. And so we did very well on things like relieving boredom, creating an enjoyable activity, and improving the day. And the qualitative feedback was great. And perhaps the simplest and best and most direct one was this. The program made me feel more like a person, me, and less like a patient. And there's been a kind of flow-on effect. For example, participant Thomas Graham wrote an entire book about how he used writing as part of his recovery. So he was a very keen advocate of the program. He came into it having experienced a stroke less than 2 weeks previously. He was still in a state of shock, really, but really engaged with the program. He's even teaching creative writing himself now to a group he belongs with, a kind of nature, a walking in nature group. And so you can hear him talking about his book. Sorry, at that link there. So we very much felt that the pilot met emotional and spiritual needs, created a new experience that was fun, creative, reflective, useful, that it did form part of the rehab process and needed to continue. And Jenny, who's here, who was kind of instrumental in setting this program up, it wouldn't have happened. It couldn't really have happened without Jenny's help. So Jenny was the curator for arts and health at this and a couple of other hospitals until, unfortunately, she retired last year. But I hope that's going well. She was a great advocate for the program, really was my go-to person in order to sort of, talk and negotiate with the various other staff there and managers of the hospital So I'm very grateful to Jenny. And she also came to every session and assisted me and helped with the scribing. It was great. So at the time, she commented, informal staff feedback is that the project has been a raging success, both by those actively engaged, checking the time, with participants and those only tangentially connected. The program has enabled patient friendships and community that extend beyond the program itself. So we did notice that kind of sense of community building across the hospital, people getting together for coffee after the writing session and things like that, and meeting up at other times. So we felt like the aims were met, and participants really embraced that opportunity to frame and reframe their narratives. There was a lot of self-reflection, and the idea of expressing oneself was really embraced. I did give a presentation about this, just thinking of academic outcomes at the Australasian Association of Writing Programs a couple of years ago. And we published a couple of things. Jenny and I co-authored an article published in Medical Humanities. And in a chapter I co-wrote with Paul and our colleague Diana Clark, and talked a bit about the hospital program as well. We got that. So the idea of keeping going was there, and we applied for funding to Canberra Hospital's foundation and got it. I was very inspired by conversations through this collaboration that UC has with University of Ulster called Difficult Conversations about communities' needs for ongoing programs, not just short ones. So we were trying to, I was very much trying to sort of respond to that idea. So we started up again in August, and we're working more now in a social prescription model. So previously in the pilot, participants self-allocated. Now there's a conflab at the beginning of the week. The team of clinicians gets together and nominates people who they think might benefit from attending the session. So that's how it's organized, more of a social prescription, which I think is pretty new to them at the hospital. So we've got the same survey and opportunity for qualitative comments, but we're also going to publish an anthology online of participant work this time. And I think the work itself speaks volumes. I've also been writing a research journal, so I write notes every week about what's happened. So I'm sort of charting experiences, similarities, dissimilarities. I'm also writing some poetry about it, which I didn't really do in the pilot, and using that as autoethnographic data. So the idea that poetry can itself be a kind of data. So I really just want to share some anecdotes, including some poetry. I've changed the names of participants, but I have the permission to reproduce the poem that I'm going to read. But I'm going to start with a poem that I wrote to illustrate one of the most joyful sessions. This was the first session back in August when we sort of reconvened, and it also reflects on the process. So I was wondering whether to call this poem Waiting or Attending. And in the end, I went for both. Waiting, attending. 22 months since the application for funding, writing a report on the pilot program, a journal article, 2 ethics applications, 3 ethics updates, budgets, meetings with the team, online and in person, arch curator, clinical managers, speech therapists, psychologists, social workers, nurses in charge, the CEO, and hospital manager. Then we began. 6 people in rehab using unfamiliar wheelchairs, 5 elderly stroke survivors, 1 young woman recovering from injury, speaking slowly, softly, hollow eyes, wrote to the prompt. And when we said, what poetic expression, such active language, those eyes smiled for the first time. I've never written a poem before. And if she glimpsed respite for a minute The next anecdote, I call this Klaus time. Um, as I mentioned, everything has to be slower, and sometimes participants note that themselves. We've read a poem, we've discussed it, we've thought about how we might write about it. We allow plenty of time for writing. I sometimes make the invitation to scribe for someone who's having trouble writing physically. But sometimes it just needs to be more time than that again. And there was, for me, like a real reconfiguring of time with Klaus, um, where he was vocalizing his response to the wonderful poem Rain by Hone Tufari. And his language was impaired. We were hanging on his every word, and having several people in a room hanging on someone's every word, willing them to say a little bit more, sensing that they had a bit more to say, a kind of silence and expectation. It was profound in itself to share that much silence with several people for quite a few minutes. And I felt after a while like I was starting to read when you could wait longer or when you could say something leading that invited a little bit more. I mentioned conversation, including I'll now mention phatic conversation, which I was never a big fan of. I'm a pretty direct sort of person. I didn't used to do small talk at all. Now I'm a big fan after working in this conversation. Phatic conversation, kind of nothing conversation, or slightly more purposeful mirroring and paraphrasing something someone has said back to them, just does encourage them to say a little bit more. So there seemed to be a certain stage in the articulation of ideas on the part of someone who's suffering from aphasia that can be sort of encouraged a little bit more. Um, and that was a fascinating thing in itself. I should have understood phatic conversation much better because I come from a culture that is masterful at it in Cornwall. Yeah, there you are. That's right. Yeah, there you are. Going on grand. Yeah, that's right. Proper job. You know, just fill the whole minute with this stuff. And yeah, there have been many times where people have taken the whole hour to write 2 lines, or they've made a comment about the content of the poetry in the last 5 minutes of the session, something like that. So there's a need to process things slowly. Another kind of silence I'll call Carol's silence. Um, in the other sessions, Carol had written poetry based entirely on childhood memories. And in this particular week, she kind of switched. I think I was starting to observe this thing about symbolic language, and that some participants um, struggle to form metaphors, which we know that the use of symbolic language can be affected by trauma, and also to decode them, to understand them. So encountering a poem that contained a lot of metaphor and was very rich in that way and beautiful, um, uh, she couldn't really engage with it. She had to sort of go somewhere else. And she wrote this kind of meta poem about us all writing poems in response to this prompt. And it included the sublime lines, silence gives you time to think. Thank you all for the silence. So she shared this silence with everyone as they were writing. And it was quite glorious. Um, One of my favorite more recent scenarios, and this is the poem I'm going to read, uh, is what I call Edith's Message. Um, so one week we read, because I was hearing that people were more used to traditional rhyming, metering poetry. I try to vary the content quite a lot, sometimes using very contemporary work that is simple and direct and very accessible, but sometimes sharing older styles that might be more familiar. So we looked at Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night by Dylan Thomas, stacked with metaphorical, symbolic illusions. And for this person, again, I had to sort of read it for them to decode all the messages. And then they got the idea that it was about death. And then we got into this amazing conversation about how people don't talk about death. I mean, of course, it's one of the big taboo subjects. And Edith was also feeling that like she couldn't take ideas from her mind and put them onto paper. And I didn't know why, of course, whether it was sort of cognitive or it didn't appear to be physical. And I didn't know, cognitive for what reason. So I offered to scribe, and this is what she wrote. So we talked about Dylan Thomas's poem being a kind of message and discussion of his father, all these images about his father, but also a message about what we should do about dying, the basic injunction, do not go gentle into that good night. So this was the message she wanted to send her family, but hadn't been able to. It's hard to say. I can't get my mind around it. This is why I wanted the family to talk, to get their ideas on what they expect afterwards. I don't know. It's hard. I need them to start the conversation, to admit that it's going to happen. They keep saying, you'll be here for Christmas, for your next birthday. They seem to push it aside and think I'm going to live forever and ever. But when you're trying to say that to somebody, they're interrupting you. So you don't finish the conversation right out. I feel if they don't accept it, they're going to grieve for too long. It's going to be bad for them. So the next week, I brought the poem back and checked it over with Edith to see if she wanted to make additions or corrections. And she didn't. She said, I didn't think it was possible. It's exactly what I wanted to say. I'm going to show it to my daughter tonight. And then the following week, she reported that she'd shown it to her family and it had opened up exactly the conversation she wanted to have. And sorry, I felt like that was the biggest achievement of my life, helping in that process. Well, I mentioned Cassie earlier, that moment of respite. When that happened, I felt like, wow, this is the most important thing I've ever done. And then I had this sort of repeat experience with Edith. This is the most important thing I've ever done. Publishing poems, anything like that, it was just meaningless, This is important. So we've done other scribing, and I'll just briefly describe another example without reading the poem. So what I've called Philip's memories. You never know where a poem's gonna take you. I feel like there's a depth of reference in a lot of poetry that is quite infinite, And so we were looking with Philip at this poem Rain. This cropped up again. And it has a line in it about the steady drum roll sound. It has a very particular kind of rhythm. It's a very simple poem, very sensual, grounded in the senses. And for this person, it didn't evoke weather. The prompt was to sort of maybe write about a weather condition, a favorite weather condition or something like that. But really interestingly, Philip centered on the rhythm of the poem and the particular voice it gave the poem. And it reminded him of the voice of a teacher that came through from the next room in adjoining classrooms when he was a kid, and how when his own teacher was away, she came and taught his class, and how much they enjoyed her voice and this kind of thing. So evoking a memory. So it never ceases to amaze me the different directions that the basic prompting and reading of poetry in itself can create. And there are contrasts to that. One participant reported having no memory, and through conversations we had, that really did seem to be true. There didn't seem to be recall in relation to what we were discussing. But in this case, this man came up with a remarkable simile when asked to write about memory. So sort of directed it back into present experience. So I find there's also no sort of continuity in terms of whether or not it's more beneficial to write about memory. People in this field talk about memory work quite a lot, which can be great, or to write about experience. Another participant could not stop talking about a very serious accident she'd had, and didn't really engage with the poems. Couldn't sort of get her to write anything about that. So eventually, okay, do you want to write about this? She couldn't write because of damage to her hand, so I can scribe for you. What would you like to say? I wrote quite an extensive poem, which we're still correcting, about experience. So we never quite know where it's going to go. Other highlights. One participant said, after 10 minutes, I was ready to leave. Now I love poetry. And I had a very similar comment about 3 weeks ago. Someone said, I came here kicking and screaming. Now I'm loving it. And I think these comments relate to uncertainty in terms of, fear about reading or writing, thinking that there's an established way to write and or to read. And in one case, we were looking at the famous cat poem by William Carlos Williams about the very careful movement of a cat climbing down some furniture. And one participant said, who was obviously having trouble with anything symbolic, but this was quite literal. Oh, I can't work that out. And I said, close your eyes and tell me what you see. And she described almost exactly the same movements, but immediately transposed it into a description of her own cat doing something sort of similar but different, which we then scribed and write down and became a poem about her cat. So there was a important insight, which I'll mention again in a minute, around the idea that visualizing or seeing is a kind of reading. So the imagery that poetry creates in the mind is an aspect of the way we read it, and sort of teasing out when that is or isn't present is potentially very useful. People have also, of course, noted the strong psychological effect, and one participant said, who became deeply moved on reading the poem Your Hands by Pablo Neruda, which is a love poem, and she had lost her husband a few months before. And of course, we're encountering, working mainly with elderly people, a lot of grief. A lot of people have lost someone very special. So there's an awareness that this is creating a kind of short-term psychological disturbance, a lot of emotions coming up, but it's okay. It's okay. We can talk about it. We can write about it. And then looking at haiku, it's like magic, one participant said. And again, people favoring the literal over the metaphorical tend to be enjoying haiku. And some people kind of read, if we look at several different haiku, which is short poems complete in themselves, they tend to sort of want to knit them together and create a theme and a clustering of them semantically, and see them in that way. So a kind of finding which I want to investigate is this idea that seeing is reading. Another is that trauma affects not just the ability to use symbolic language, but to decode it. So there's a lot to think about in terms of how we read. There's so much to think about here too, in terms of how engaging reading is. I want to know more about the neurology of that, how many centers of the brain are firing when we're reading something, as well as when we're writing it. Speech very definitely seems like a pathway to writing. I've been amazed at the sort of accuracy of what I'm calling dictation poems, that people have said things like, I don't know what to write, or I can't put pen to paper. You ask them to speak and they speak with great accuracy. And sometimes very little correction occurring in subsequent visits. And another one sort of allied to this is that maybe as well as phatic speech, there can be phatic writing. So in Edith's poem, for example, we retained her starting line, which is kind of phatic. Oh, it's hard to say. And I don't know, it's hard. It's very much part of the poem, but it's also part of the thinking process of, yeah, I don't know, I'm just getting going here. And, you know, I sometimes start writing by writing on the, I don't know what to write because I know I want to write something, but I don't know what. I'd be honest about it, and that gets you going. And creative writing teachers know this and have little tricks about it. But I'm thinking that, yeah, I don't know if it's a term already in use, but phatic writing, is there a benefit from phatic writing? So I gave a talk in Kyushu last year about this. Plans for the future, the scope already in place to extend the program, which ends in June, for another 6 months. We might also diversify the model into more of a kind of one-to-one on the wards scenario. We might extend it to other cohorts. I've had a meeting with Dr. Samit Rai from ICU about the possibility of running something post ICU survival for patients and their families. That could be great. We're going to talk about this stuff at this symposium we're part of in Kyushu a bit later this year, and I'll talk about it again at the AAWP conference and hopefully in London next year. And I've got a couple of articles planned to write about, particularly for the journal, The Arts and Psychotherapy. And broader plans, I was asked to sort of convene a group here at UC of creative writing academics who were working in this kind of arts and health field, which is basically all of us in creative writing. Everyone is doing that or has expressed a keen interest in doing so. I'm also looking at developing a national network through the AAWP and have been asked to write a scoping report on arts and health for presentation in December. And then we've got these things going on internationally with Kyushu and colleagues at the University of Ghent who've already got this very interesting medical humanities network, CHARM, Consortium for Health Humanities, Arts, Reading and Medicine. The guy leading that is particularly interested in bibliotherapy. And there are the references. Thank you.
Right. Thanks so much, Owen. I'm going to call for questions or comments.
Hi, Owen. That was, excuse me, need to get my projection on. That was fantastic. I have come from a peer work background. Certainly have seen a lot of impact on poetry through Mad Poetry, which was originally run through Verity La and then is now David Stavanger at Red Room has Mad Poetry, and that runs every October. And there's workshops for patients with mental health challenges, or not even, it's in the community as well. I'm really, really curious as a peer worker and trained in peer work supervision, whether you've thought about extending this program in a way that's peer practice led, because you're going to have certainly people coming through these programs like the person that you mentioned who is now teaching creative writing. That is in effect peer work. Peer work is a discipline and we do train in it, but it is taking your lived experience of that debilitating thing and then being able to show up for others in that way. And we see this so often in creative work, is that it's a really interesting litmus. It's largely something that has come into effect in the mental health sector, although Canberra has always, for some strange reason, been very, very slow on the uptake. Nationally, it's got a much larger uptake. ACT Health doesn't really seem to get it. But it is a really, really interesting way of taking people like your person that's now running creative writing workshops and saying, hey, I have that lived experience, that particular lived experience of having my brain. I mean, I'm neurodivergent and I have neurological condition and I get aphasia from that perspective as well. But it's being able to say, I know what this feels like. I know what it was like when I came to poetry. I know all of those things. And I'm here for you in that way as well, because it continues to build the community that you're talking about that has developed out of this. But it puts it back in the hands of people that have been totally disempowered by that experience.
Yeah, I haven't. I mean, I've thought of that about that a little bit, but I'm definitely interested in the potential of that. Um, we have Irfan Master and Andy Stapp have led some of the sessions at the hospital when I've been away, and have been really grateful for their input. And Irfan suggested that we lead something for the nursing staff at the hospital, and so we're keen to do that. And every week, I should have mentioned, an allied health nurse attends to assist, at least one, and sometimes a social worker as well. And often I draw them in and get them writing as well. And yeah, we definitely want to do something like that. And there is conversation around some of the grant applications colleagues are making around programs that create teaching frameworks that other people can adopt and use. But yeah, peers coming through. Thomas, for example, offered to be a volunteer on the program, which we were interested in, but the sort of volunteer protocols seem a bit complicated at the hospital, so we haven't got that happening yet. So I guess my short answer is yes, I'd love to do things like that, and I can see, the kind of organic potential of that and how it might spread, and you know, make best use of everything that's happened. Yeah, and the sharing of those experiences. Mm.
Other questions or comments? Mick?
Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you, Owen. That was really terrific. I'm vaguely aware what PTSD is. I'm not sure what aphasia is and how that idea relates. I was particularly interested in this idea of reframing and whether that's taking one narrative and replacing it with another narrative or something more general than that.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so I did sort of mention in passing, but probably didn't clarify that much. So aphasia is a language disorder where there's been that affects a communication in terms of not just speaking, but reading and understanding, but has no effect whatsoever on intelligence. So it's just the sort of mechanism is disturbed. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So when you kind of experience something that is, outside of your frame of reference that you can sort of explain to yourself, that is so shocking that it sort of disturbs your understanding of life or your worldview. Often sort of before major life experiences, like if a child loses a parent at 12, that's going to be implicitly traumatic. It might still be traumatic when they're 25, but they might have mechanisms in place for dealing with it then that are rather different, so PTSD and aphasia you were asking about, and the other point,
Reframing.
the reframing thing. I mean, I haven't really tested this formally. The best test would be to write a story of an incident of your life at the beginning of the program, and then rewrite it at the end and see what had happened. But people have observed this phenomenon of feeling rather different about their traumatic story once they've articulated it in writing, and have that sense of, as I mentioned, like distance and control over it. And I've been doing this myself, about childhood trauma, and you realize a very crazy thing that you can, in a sense, to use that overused, self-help phrase, change your own reality. You can change your perception. I've written this story about my interaction with my father 6 months ago. This version could be slightly different. What do I want to emphasize? What do I want to investigate? It's quite an otherworldly element of writing, I think, that you can frame and reframe a narrative of personal experience and perception of that experience. But whatever one's ideas or theories about it, it does seem to really make a difference to how you feel, and therefore how you engage with the next day. So one might have ideals about that as being sort of slightly fake or unreal, say, but in practice, it can make people behave differently. So
Thank you.
it seems worthwhile. Yeah. Great questions. Thanks.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for that. Oh, and I really relate to it because I have had a very close friend at the University of Canberra Hospital. She's out of it now, but she was there for 2 months. But she's on the dementia pathway. Rather than going into that, it wasn't poetry. It was a book that she was familiar with. I would read her sentences, and that would get her to start speaking.
Yeah.
What's from your presentation, what really struck me was the individual differences and how different the mind works. It seems to me that for the nursing staff, that what you've tantalizingly provided is the framework for particular therapies. And sort of as a teacher, as you know, developing curriculum and other things, to be able to leave behind a process for staff to use rather than a medication or a formal doctor's approach. This is actually connecting with the psyche of individuals. But I mean, when you start thinking, who would pay for it? Will AI take it over? You know, all of these things, it is so individual and personal. And it either needs a one-to-one or it needs that community, 6 people or 8 people, not more, that can, which we know from tutorials and other things, the ones that really work and get people to engage. So your teaching experience moving to this sort of therapeutic approach is wonderful, and congratulations. I think it's a wonderful program that you've developed.
Yeah,
both of you.
I think to respond to that, it builds a bit on the question Fee asked in a way about like developing a method, and I definitely want to shoot for that, but I feel like I'm not ready for that yet. You know, I've got to get a certain amount of experience in place. But it's totally analogous to the way, like in my research, that's more purely about the mechanics of poetry. You know, I'm all the time trying to alert students to techniques. Then when you're well grounded in that, you can sort of build that into a methodology. And I was doing that with my poetry and process research project, sort of trying to synthesize all of the stuff about particular mechanics into an overall approach that you could sort of leave behind for other researchers to sort of work with when you've retired, sort of thing. You know, it's analogous to this. Like, so I think that is ultimately what I'm shooting for, but it's a process, and I need to sort of build up the understanding of, as you say, how to work with different scenarios. I was listening to a lot of podcasts a little while ago about neuroplasticity, and I came across a doctor who had led a project in the States where he had kind of systematically argued for mass brain scans of anyone treated by psychiatrists. He was a psychiatrist who'd been trained in radiography, so he was very familiar with the technology that was used. And sometimes in conflict with his friends, with his colleagues, he said, you know, psychiatrists are a unique group of people, that they're an expert on a part of the body that they actually mechanically know very little about sometimes, you know, and he was demonstrating that the knowledge gained from a brain scan of individual made you able to offer a specific treatment. And his theory was that for psychiatric conditions, that there was no generic treatment. It had to be specific for every individual. And so there's a lot of mechanics, obviously, we've got to try and understand.
Yeah, I think Diane's comment there has really opened an exciting perspective on what you're doing. Like the idea that your creative writing work might be paving the way for bespoke treatments for individual patients. That's really fascinating. I wanted to ask you about something quite different. And that's a comment you made about poetic constraint and subjects with aphasia. and how I think you said that some of those subjects had a preference for working with poetic constraint. Did I hear that right?
Well, last year someone said, "Is there a name for this thing you're getting us to do, where we've got to write about this and then write about that at the same time?" And that's kind of form of poetic restraint. You have to write in which you use these specific elements, or you can't use these elements. And similar observations came up recently, just a few weeks ago, where a couple of people said, it's actually better when we've got really exacting instructions and prompts to follow, isn't it? Than if we can just write about whatever we want. Like, people are actually, people who are completely untrained in creative writing or poetry are noticing that has better results. That they drill into something more specific. They kind of invoke their creativity a little bit more. But in the literature on aphasia, it suggests, it recommends using poetic constraint in teaching quite extensively, even down to very fine-grained discussions of erasure poetry or blackout poetry, or use of word lists and constraints around that, which I haven't really tried that much yet, to be honest. I want to try erasure at some point. We haven't tried that yet, but sometimes I get requests, so I'm sort of responding to those as well. We did limericks last week because somebody requested them the week before. So yeah, there's a lot to sort of investigate in those terms. But yeah, I'm really sort of feel quite newly inspired, because I've always loved poetic constraint, by the fact that participants are noticing that it's advantageous.
Thank you.
Thank you. Look, just reflecting again, just what a wonderful program it is. I can't say strongly enough how magical it was watching people come alive in those sessions. But hearing you speak today, one of the things I heard was you spoke about silences. And I was thinking that one of the things that poetry is really good at is about using words in a very considered way and validating silences. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about that.
Validating silences. Yeah, well, the only thought that comes to mind there is really that the best way to validate silences is to share them, is to have them.
But as a discipline, poetry does that. I don't know any other disciplines except for music that does it.
Yeah, music. I mean, silence is so important in music. Someone said half of Beethoven is silence, and without silence, you just have chaos in music. Obviously, I'm a fan of silence, but yeah, people have talked a lot of people have talked about how poetry slows you down. The reading of poetry is, in most cases, slower than the reading of other texts. I'd argue that haiku slows you down even more as one face of that. So that's important. I mean, someone pointed out to me recently, there are forms of poetry that kind of speed you up and increase your heart rate, but on the whole, it slows you down. So I guess it's got that crossover with the contemplative and with mindfulness. I've been writing a lot about the link between haiku and mindfulness, and they seem to be really sit together so well that one is a version of the other. So I think all we can do is sort of try and protect the silence and create environments where it's valued. Almost by definition, I don't want to say too much about it. Just create the experience. I think that's what a lot of people need.
Hi, Owen. Thank you. What a beautiful program. Just gorgeous. As a visual artist, I'm wondering whether, any methodology that you might develop, or I'm also interested in this bespoke nature, and as a stitcher predominantly, and there's a lot written about the therapeutic nature of the repetitive nature of stitching. Is there potential to expand the program from the written arts into other creative arts?
Oh yeah, and that's very much what Jenny wanted to do, you know, to have poetry as simply one activity of many, a whole suite of things, you know, including there's some music therapy happening down there, but you know, use of art trolleys and things like that. And yeah, I mean, it's a question of finding the right people to collaborate with. But
I'll put my hand up.
yeah. I know you're interested. So yeah, we'll talk more about that for sure. And I definitely think there's potential for transferable knowledge and skills, like both within this program and in general across art forms. Like I mentioned, my poetry and process research. I couldn't manage to sell the idea to funders. That I applied for 4 different grants. I didn't get any of them. And so I had to sort of lessen the amount of time I spent on the project, but it's still kind of going. I felt 100% confident that I'd sort of helped assemble a body of knowledge that was transferable to other arts disciplines and even into business settings, but I couldn't get anybody to believe me. So I guess I'm going to have to just do it, you know, pro bono, prove my case, do a workshop with some visual artists and some business people, working with processes, not specific techniques necessarily, processes developed by innovative poets, and show that it's a thing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got time for one more question or comment from Ifa.
Hi, Owen. Lovely paper, beautiful. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I was really proud to be part of the program for a little while. So what do you think in terms of raising the profile within the hospital itself? We've talked about this a lot, so I'm just sort of asking you a question that I kind of know the answer to, but it'd be good for people to understand a little bit more, because it's a beautiful program. People come, and we've talked about some of the difficulties of them getting there in the wheelchairs and the struggles to get there as well. But being almost active as a group weekly, but also working closely with the clinicians to be referred as a person who can go and sit with someone and work with them individually as well. We've talked about this as well, that could be a very active, proactive form, not only for you, but other people who might want to help you, like me and others as well. What do you feel about that in terms of a process going forward?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's something I want to talk about with the hospital manager very soon. So like diversifying the activities and the model. You know, we mentioned AAWP a couple of times. You know, we were quite inspired meeting a guy from Adelaide who was using poetry on a social prescription model, working one-to-one with people in the ward of a hospital. So definitely want to see if we can establish that option. Definitely want to do stuff with staff as well, and profile in the hospital. The other thing we talked about is having an exhibition of framed poems on some of the wards. I think that will help. But there's nothing like sort of just gradual grassroots building it up. You know, I feel like people are getting more on board. Like I mentioned, the allied health nurses are sort of hearing about it, getting more involved. You know, someone came last week and said, "Oh, so and so had a wonderful time last week." You know, so one of the nurses. So I think you do need to be around a while and just get to know people. But I think an exhibition would be good. You know, like we're going to have some poems on a website, and then maybe we'll look at framing some of those poems too and putting them somewhere really obvious, as Jenny did with some of the visual art stuff. So yeah, I think that will help, and it will keep people talking about it as well. Yeah. So any or all of those ideas.
Fantastic. Thank you, Al.
Thank you.